I'm afraid, yes. I mean, it's an amateurish approach to almost anything that Trump does. We've seen that in the Russia-Ukraine negotiations, and it's just been quite extraordinary over the last week. I mean, the formula was a kindergarten-style formula. It showed little depth, little understanding of trade and how to adjust trade. I mean, it's shocking that the leader of the free world, the biggest economy in the world, the leader of multilateral organizations is behaving like a mafia mob leader, an extortioner. But I guess what worries me most is this is such a shock. I mean, this is far worse than anyone expected in terms of the level of tariffs and the procedure being rolled out. It's even worse than '08 global financial crisis, even worse than COVID, because we don't have the international coordination and joined up thinking led by the Americans ultimately that we saw in those periods. So it's a really, really frightening world that we're going into. Well, look, I mean, every reputable economist, I think the time of the US elections last year, the run up to elections, and then the period after elections, I think everyone gave the same message that trade protectionism is bad for global trade, it's bad for global growth, and ultimately it will probably mean more inflation. So it will probably mean that everyone globally, including the US and US consumers, will also be poorer off. But clearly, Trump and MAGA, it's a powerful message that they've push down people's throats. They exploit fear, vulnerability, weakness, etc., for their own advantage. And unfortunately, we're now seeing the consequences of that. I mean, the irony, I guess, in all this with the collapse of global stock markets is that many of the richest in the world will be suffering most now. I mean, it's ironic that some of Trump's backers, original backers, are now coming out and arguing, like Bill Ackman now, is coming out arguing against Trump policies in terms of protectionism. So they clearly now understand the consequences of Trump's chaotic approach in terms of tariffs and protectionism, right? So I think we're entering a different world. And actually, the US may not be the ultimate winner in all this. I mean, I think it's quite the irony, perhaps, in all this is that US actions now in terms of protectionism, US actions against Panama, Greenland, Trump's approach to Ukraine. We had the famous Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, and then we have this crazy minerals deal, and his approach to President Putin. I mean, the US is coming across as a global bully, right? And probably countries will actually be looking at China and hoping China actually takes the bully on and levels the playing field. And it's broader than this, right? It's not just about tariffs. It's about the US treating its allies very badly. If I was Europe, I'd be looking at the US not as a trusted partner, and I'd be looking to new alliances. I'd be looking actually to get closer to China. I don't think the Chinese leadership don't come over to Europe and criticize European values like J.D. Vance did. So I think the Americans need to be pretty careful with this approach, right? I mean, they are destroying alliances that have been built up over many years and actually, I think, proven pretty helpful for the US. But anyway, Trump thinks he knows about better than anyone else about everything in the world, right? I'm afraid, well, I mean, irrespective of what happens in terms of markets, and I think the Trump administration has clearly shown that it is in favor of territorial conquest, expansion. Obviously, it's put pressure on Panama in terms of control of the Panama Canal. They've made clear indications that they want to take ownership or control of Greenland. I mean, that's extraordinary development, given it's currently controlled by Denmark, a NATO ally that is obviously against that. The opinion polls suggest the people of Greenland are against it as well. So, are we going to imagine a scenario where the US militarily takes over Greenland? I mean, I think that's a possibility, which is, again, utterly extraordinary. I mean, Previously, the US administration was backing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Against Russia, now we see the Trump administration adopting a very pro-Russian approach. Well, the invasion of Ukraine and Russia taking territory in Ukraine through conquest is okay, and the US accepts, that Russia takes Crimea and the four oblasts in Ukraine that Russia significantly occupies at the moment, in exchange for Russia being okay with the US taking Greenland and the Panama Canal. And does that also mean that, Israel takes Gaza, Israel takes the West Bank? Does it mean that China takes Taiwan? I mean, that would seem to be the message from the Trump administration. The big countries, the powerful countries can expand their borders through conquest, right? I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. I guess the post-Second World Order suggested that wasn't the case, or that was the norm, that countries' borders were sacrosanct. But anyway, Trump is seeming to change that now. I mean, if you remember, there was that film in the US, Wag the Dog, right? I think it's very likely that Trump will try and change the news cycle by doing something crazy somewhere else in the world. I think there was a relatively high probability of an Israeli-US strike on Iran anyway during this presidency. I think because of the problems with tariffs and now the US markets, I think that the probability has increased very significantly. The danger from that is that, we have a slowing of the global economy, lower commodity prices, but then ultimately the risk of a US-Israeli attack on Iran, which will then boost commodity prices and probably provide a second systemic shock to the global economy. Again, I think that's going to be bad for growth if that happens globally. I mean, this is an administration that is not showing great understanding of international economics in general, and also the security reality in particularly in Europe. Frightening prospect. Well, I do worry that the US model, democracy, rule of law, values. I worry about democracy in the US. I worry about overconcentration of power. I worry about that what we're seeing is a change, that we could see electoral rules changed in the US to keep the Republican Party in power. It's incredible that we're talking about the potential that Trump could get a third term, that somehow, and we're seeing capture of the judiciary in the US, capture of big business, the media space, the social media space. I am very worried that we may never see a competitive US election again. We'll see a managed democracy in the US. The rhetoric used by Trump against his political opponents is pretty striking. So, I think the US could be heading to an autocratic, kleptocratic cacocracy, which is not a great outlook, given that the US is still the biggest economy in the world and the dominant economic policy setter globally. It still dominates multilateral institutions that, unfortunately, we all have to kind of abide by. I think Europe now gets it, right? Europe now gets that it's, that US and Europe have different interests and different values, and that Europe has to be responsible for its own defense and security. And the number one threat to Europe is Russia. And I think we are seeing European countries understand that and finally increase defense spending and increase defense and security cooperation. So yes, we are seeing the UK brought back into political and security and defense structures in Europe. That's really, really encouraging. I hope that Turkey will also be brought into those relationships and structures. Turkey was invited into the various Ukraine kind of peacekeeping kind of and security meetings we saw in London and Paris. Turkey has, it's an important NATO member, but obviously it's the biggest European NATO army military force. It has a huge military industrial complex. Turkey can benefit from coordination with this. There's going to be a huge increase in defense spending in Europe. Turkey can benefit from that. So look, yes, the positive is Europe has been brought together by this external threat from the US and Russia. And I hope there's a broader reach out to Turkey and countries around the Mediterranean, and probably also China. And obviously, I think Turkey and Europe certainly have common interests in making sure Russia doesn't win in Ukraine. A Russian victory in Ukraine will be bad for Turkey because it would mean Russian dominance over the Black Sea. Obviously, Turkey and Russia don't have a great track record in terms of fighting wars historically. So Russia has proven to be a constant threat also to Turkey. So I think Turkey has an interest in working with Europe to ensure its defence